They said the town of Red Willow had been built by men who feared nothing. But fear lived there anyway. It lived in the warped boards of the auction platform, in the way dust collected like an accusation along the street seams, in the way people learned to look slightly to the side when something unforgivable was happening in broad daylight. Red Willow did not bother with secrecy. It simply relied on the town's greatest religion, minding your own business. And something unforgivable was happening now. The sun had risen mean and pale, like it had woken up disappointed in the world. Heat already pressed on the town square, turning every breath into a dry scrape. A few horses shifted in the shade of the hitching rail, ears flicking. A child sat cross-legged near a barrel, chewing on a piece of straw and staring too hard, as if his eyes could understand what adults pretended not to. On the platform stood a woman, barefoot, not chained, not tied. She didn't need to be. At 57, Margaret Hale had mastered stillness the way some people mastered prayer. Her spine remained straight, her chin level, her hands folded calmly at her waist. The dress she wore had once been blue, real blue, the kind of fabric that meant someone cared once. Now it was faded into a color that couldn't decide whether it belonged to sky or ash, patched at the elbows, mended at the hem with thread that didn't match, because the world rarely offered matching things to women like Margaret. Her feet burned against the sun-heated wood, but she refused the flinch. Flinching was a luxury. Flinching invited commentary, and Margaret had lived too long under the sharp little knives of commentary. Before this story goes any further, before the dust settles, before the choice is made, take a second. If you believe stories about forgotten people, second chances, and quiet courage still matter, hit like so this one doesn't get buried. And subscribe if you want more Western stories that stare straight at the hard parts without blinking. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, because these truths survive only when they're carried forward. The auctioneer cleared his throat. He was a thin man with a red face and a voice trained to turn human beings into inventory. His shirt was too clean for the work he did, which said everything anyone needed to know about him. "Well then," he announced, lifting a paper as if he were reading weather. "We've got Margaret Hale, widowed. Still strong enough for cooking, laundry, minding children, light ranch work." Light. The word drifted over the square like smoke. Someone laughed. Not loudly. Just enough to grant permission. A man near the front shook his head, as if he were embarrassed for the universe. "Too old," he muttered. A woman, arms crossed tight, said, "Who'd waste flour on that?" A different man, half hidden behind another shoulder, let out the kind of snort meant to signal superiority. "My mule's got more future than she does." Margaret watched their mouths move and thought, with distant calm, that cruelty was often lazy. It rarely bothered to be creative. It repeated itself generation after generation, like a bad hymn. She'd been awake since before dawn. In a small room behind the boarding house, she had listened to her nephew's boots pacing the hallway. Back and forth, not anxious, purposeful. The pacing of someone building courage from motion. He never came inside to say goodbye. He didn't need to. The goodbye had happened months ago, quietly, when his wife began to look at Margaret as if she were a cough that wouldn't stop. When the drought turned fields to cracked pottery. When the pantry thinned. When the math of survival started speaking louder than the history of kindness. Margaret had raised her nephew after his parents died. She had fed him, cleaned him, patched him, loved him in the way women are expected to love, silently, completely, without invoices. Now he had brought her to Red Willow, and the price of her life, of her body, her labor, her remaining breath, was a single sack of grain tied with twine.
Enough to keep a younger family alive, not enough to keep an older woman human. The auctioneer raised his gavel. "Let's be done with this. Who's starting at—" A hand went up, not eager, not proud. Resigned. $2. Another hand. 3. The bidding crawled forward like a wounded thing, dragging itself through dirt. No one wanted Margaret. They only wanted the satisfaction of getting something cheap. A bargain. A story to tell later. Got myself a worker for almost nothing. Ain't I clever? Margaret stared past the crowd, beyond the square, toward the road that ran south until it disappeared into heat shimmer. She wondered what it might feel like to walk that road without permission, to go somewhere just because her feet wanted to go. Then a voice cut through the heat. Clear, controlled. Angry in a way that didn't shout, because it didn't need to. "You don't sell people." The square froze like someone had thrown cold water on it. A man stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. Dust clung to his boots. His coat was sun-faded, worn at the shoulders, and stitched in places where fabric had surrendered and been forced back into service. He wasn't tall, he wasn't broad, but he stood like a man who knew what it meant to be pushed and refused to keep moving backward. He reached the auctioneer's table and dropped a leather pouch. Coins spilled out, bright in the sunlight, clattering against the wood with a sound that changed the air. Money had a voice in Red Willow. Money spoke louder than shame. "Count it," the man said. The auctioneer hesitated, eyes flicking from the coin to the man's face, measuring risk. "That's 3 months' wages," the man continued, calm as a storm front. "More than whatever lie you're calling her debt." A murmur traveled through the crowd. 3 months' wages could feed a family through winter. 3 months' wages could buy a horse. 3 months' wages could buy silence. The auctioneer licked his lips. "Now hold on, sir. This is lawful." "It's disgusting," the man corrected. "And it ends here." A woman in the crowd scoffed. "What would you want with her?" The man did not look away from Margaret. "Help," he said, and honesty. He turned fully toward her then, and his eyes landed on her like a hand that didn't take, only steadied. Storm-gray eyes. Eyes that had seen loss and kept breathing anyway. "My name's Caleb Rourke," he said. "I run a ranch south of the Sable River. I pay wages. You come if you choose. You leave when you choose. No contracts. No ownership." Margaret's throat tightened, not with fear, with something worse, disbelief. "Why?" she asked, voice steady even when her insides weren't. Caleb paused, as if the question deserved a real answer. "Because everyone else sees what life took from you," he said. "I see what survived." The auctioneer cleared his throat again, eager to regain control of the moment. "So you're purchasing—" "I'm not buying her," Caleb said, sharp enough to cut. He extended his hand toward Margaret, palm open, steady. "I'm offering her a way out." Margaret stared at his hand. It was scarred. The kind of scars that came from rope, wood, weather, and stubborn labor. It did not tremble. It did not reach like a hook. It waited. There was a long moment where Red Willow held its breath, watching an older woman decide whether mercy was real or simply another costume cruelty war. Margaret placed her hand in his. Her skin was dry, weathered. Her grip was firm. Caleb helped her step down from the platform, as if she were stepping off a porch rather than a public humiliation. And the town watched a woman walk away without ever once looking back. But something did look back. Not Margaret. Someone else. From the far side of the square, near the feed store, a man leaned against the wall as if he were just enjoying the shade. His hat brim shadowed his eyes. His smile was small, private, and sharp. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He watched Caleb's hand on Margaret's elbow, like a man memorizing a face. And then he walked away. The road south of Red Willow didn't bother pretending to be kind. It cut through scrub and stone, followed a dry riverbed that remembered water like a rumor, and climbed into low hills where the wind carried dust, the way a preacher carries judgment. Margaret rode beside Caleb in a wagon that creaked with every bump. The boards were old. The wheels complained. The harness leather looked like it had been repaired too many times by someone who refused to quit. Neither spoke much, not because silence was awkward, because silence was respectful. Margaret watched the land unfold. The horizon lay flat and endless, a line drawn by God with a tired hand. Cacti stood like stubborn men, refusing to sit down. A hawk circled above, patient as hunger. Every few miles, they passed a fence line half collapsed, posts leaning as if the earth itself was too exhausted to stand upright. Caleb drove with the quiet focus of a man who lived in responsibility. Not the performative kind, the real kind that weighed your shoulders down over time. After a long stretch, he said, "You'll have your own room." Margaret didn't answer right away. "I mean it," he added, as if he'd learned that the world often said things it didn't mean. "Door locks from the inside." Margaret looked at him, just briefly. He kept his eyes on the road. Privacy. Dignity. Those words didn't exist in her recent life. She'd been a presence in a house, an extra chair at the table, a set of hands that worked until they shook, a ghost that swept floors. A room with a lock was not luxury. It was a declaration. You are allowed to exist. By late afternoon, the ranch appeared. It wasn't grand. It wasn't a postcard. It was a house leaning slightly west, as if tired of standing upright. A barn patched with boards that didn't match, fences stitched together by stubbornness more than skill. The land around it looked overworked and underloved, like a horse that had been ridden too hard and fed too little. But there was something else, too. A sense that the place, despite its exhaustion, was still fighting. Caleb stopped the wagon in front of the house. He climbed down, then offered a hand to Margaret, not because she couldn't step down, but because offering help without humiliation was its own kind of kindness. Margaret stepped onto the dirt, worked dirt, claimed dirt. She inhaled. The air smelled like sun-warmed hay, old wood, and sweat. Honest smells. Inside the house, Caleb moved with quiet efficiency. Kettle on the stove, bread cut thick. A jar of preserves opened. 2 chipped mugs set on the table. "Eat," he said. "Tomorrow's long." No commands, no barked orders, just a fact, shared like an equal. Margaret ate slowly, tasting each bite as if it might evaporate if she rushed. Food had always been weaponized around her. If she ate too much, she was greedy. If she ate too little, she was ungrateful. Here the bread simply existed. It didn't accuse her. After supper, Caleb showed her the room. Small, clean. A narrow bed, a wash basin, a window facing east, and a door with a lock. Margaret's chest tightened. She stepped inside and ran her fingers along the window frame like she was touching proof. Caleb paused at the doorway. "If anything here doesn't work for you," he said, "we'll fix it." We. No one had ever used we with her, unless they were dividing her labor. When Caleb left, Margaret locked the door. The click was small, but it felt like thunder. She sat on the bed and listened to the house. The wind tested the shutters. The old boards creaked. Somewhere outside, a coyote called out, lonely as a question.
Margaret lay down and stared at the ceiling. Sleep came in cautious waves. She woke once, startled, bracing for a shout that didn't come, for footsteps approaching the door, for anger. Instead, there was only quiet, real quiet, the kind that didn't threaten, the kind that allowed breathing. Morning arrived pale and cool, the best kind of morning on hard land. Margaret stepped outside to find Caleb already moving. He'd been up before the sun, checking the fence line with the focused intensity of a man who'd learned that neglect was expensive. He handed Margaret a pair of gloves. "These posts are heavier than they look," he said. "Don't strain yourself." Margaret stared at the gloves, then at him, then at the fence line. She didn't reply. She simply walked to the nearest post, tested its weight, and lifted it. Not dramatically, not to make a point. Just the way she always had. Caleb watched her shoulders take the weight like they were built for it. "You'll hurt yourself," he said. But his voice didn't carry command. It carried concern. "I've carried heavier," Margaret replied. She didn't say where. She didn't say how. The truth didn't need decoration. They worked side by side. Hammer strikes punctuated the air. Nails bit into wood. Sweat gathered at their temples as the sun climbed. Margaret moved with the efficiency of someone who had worked all her life without thanks. Her hands knew the rhythm of labor. Her body understood endurance, like a second language. At midday, they sat beneath a cottonwood near what remained of a creek. The creek wasn't truly a creek anymore, just a shallow line of damp earth and a few stubborn pools, but it was enough to attract shade and a little bit of green. Caleb handed her the canteen. Margaret drank, then wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. Caleb looked out at the fence line, jaw tight. "Your nephew," he said quietly. "He worked you hard." Margaret didn't deny it. Denial would have been a kind of loyalty she no longer owed. "Yes." A silence. Caleb's fingers tightened around the canteen strap. Not anger at her, anger at what the world had demanded from her. Margaret studied him from the corner of her eye. He carried grief the way some men carry rifles, always within reach, never spoken of unless necessary. The ranch became their language. Days turned into weeks. The fence line straightened. The barn stopped groaning as much in the wind. The house grew warmer, not because the stove was better, but because the air inside it stopped expecting cruelty. Margaret found herself laughing once, quietly, unexpectedly, when Caleb tried to fix a hinge and the door refused to cooperate, swinging shut like it had opinions. "That door hates me," he muttered. Margaret's laugh came out like a surprised bird. Caleb paused, then smiled faintly, as if the sound meant more than humor. The laughter embarrassed Margaret, not because she regretted it, but because it reminded her how long it had been since laughter was allowed. One evening, after supper, Caleb sat at the table with a ledger and a pencil worn down from use. Margaret dried dishes, watching his brow furrow. "I want to offer you something," Caleb said. Margaret's shoulders tightened automatically. Offers had always come with hooks. Caleb looked up. "More than wages." She waited. "If you stay 2 years," he continued, "work like you've been working, I'll give you a share. Not charity, a real stake. When we sell stock, you get part of the profit." Margaret stared at him, as if he'd spoken in a language she'd never heard. "No one's ever offered me a share of anything," she said. Caleb's voice softened. Then they were blind. That night, after the lamp was out, Margaret lay awake, listening to the ranch breathe. The wind outside sounded less like judgment and more like weather. The future, which had always felt like a closing fist, felt slightly open. But something else was moving too. Not in the house,
beyond it, farther than fences, as if the land itself had noticed that Caleb Rourke was rebuilding. And some people in the world hated when other people rebuilt. The riders came at dawn. Margaret was in the garden behind the house, pulling weeds from around stubborn sprouts, when the sound reached her. Hoofbeats, steady and slow, the kind of pace meant to announce power. She straightened, hands dirty, heart calm in that strange way it got right before danger. Not fear. Readiness. 5 men crested the rise beyond the fence, silhouettes first, then shapes, then faces. Dust rose behind them like a warning. They didn't hurry. Men who hurry are uncertain. These men had already decided how this day would go. Caleb stepped out onto the porch. He didn't reach for a rifle. That told Margaret everything. This wasn't a random trouble. This was an expected trouble. The lead rider dismounted. His boots hit the dirt with practiced ease. He smiled like someone who enjoyed rehearsing disappointment. "Morning," he said. "Name's Elias Crow. I represent Harlan Blackwell." That name had weight in the valley, the way certain storms had names. Caleb's jaw tightened. "We're not selling." Crow chuckled. "I didn't ask if you were ready." He gestured lazily toward the barn. "Dry season. Fires move fast. Accidents faster. Would be a shame for a man working so hard to lose it all to bad luck." The other riders sat still in their saddles, hands near their holsters, eyes empty of sympathy. Not killers, yet. But men comfortable standing beside killers. Caleb took one step forward, voice low. "Tell Blackwell he can go." Margaret spoke before he finished. "There's a flaw in your plan," she said. Crow turned toward her, surprised. Not because she spoke, but because her voice carried no tremor. "Threatening arson gets a man hanged," Margaret continued calmly. 5 witnesses is 4 too many for a man who values discretion. Crow's smile thinned. "You think an old woman can stop 5 armed men?" Margaret looked at him with the steady gaze of someone who had outlived worse than threats. "I think you were sent to scare us," she said. "Not burn us. Violence leaves evidence. Fear leaves silence. And Blackwell prefers silence." For a long moment, the valley held its breath. Crow's eyes narrowed as if he were trying to decide what kind of woman this was, brave or foolish. Then he spat on the dirt. "This isn't finished." He swung back into his saddle. The riders turned and thundered away, dust trailing behind them like the tail of a threat. Caleb stood still for a moment, shoulders tight, as if the air itself had become heavier. Then he exhaled. "That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen," he said, voice rough, "or the most dangerous." Margaret looked down at her hands, now shaking slightly, the delayed tremor of adrenaline. "They didn't hurt us," she said. "That's what matters." They rode into town that day. Not Red Willow, another smaller settlement downriver, where the sheriff still pretended the law was a thing that existed. Caleb spoke plainly. He named Crow. He named Blackwell. He described the threat. The sheriff listened with the expression of a man weighing his own survival. When Caleb left, the sheriff said, "I'll write it down. That's about all I can promise." Sometimes the law was a pencil, but even a pencil could become a weapon if enough people read what it wrote. Weeks passed. No fire came. But the tension did. It lived in the quiet spaces, the way Caleb checked the horizon too often, the way Margaret slept lighter, listening for hoofbeats that weren't there, the way Eliza, now staying with them after Caleb found her in town, hungry and shaken, jumped at every loud noise. Eliza was young, maybe 19, with a bruise-colored sadness in her eyes. She didn't talk much at first. When she did, her words came out in careful fragments, as if she feared the truth would punish her for existing. Margaret understood that kind of fear. She never forced Eliza to speak. She simply gave her food, blankets, and quiet. One evening, after supper, Eliza whispered, "He owns everything." Margaret set a hand over hers. "He doesn't own the sky," she said. "He doesn't own the river, and he doesn't own you." Eliza's eyes filled with tears she tried to hide. Margaret didn't comment. Some tears needed privacy. Then the barn betrayed them. It happened on an afternoon when the wind had the taste of coming rain, but no promise of it. Margaret climbed into the barn loft to check hay stores. The boards underfoot looked solid. They had looked solid yesterday, too. The plank cracked. Not loudly. Not enough warning. Margaret dropped through, the world falling away like a trapdoor in hell. She caught a support beam by instinct, fingers screaming as splinters bit deep. Her body swung into open air, weight pulling at her shoulders. For a fraction of a second, she hung between two outcomes, life and the sudden quiet of death. Then Caleb's voice tore through the barn. "Margaret!" He came like a man being chased by ghosts, boots pounding, ladder rattling. His face went white when he saw her hanging there. He threw himself flat on the loft floor, reaching down, fingers locking around her wrists. "I've got you," he said, voice shaking. "I've got you. Don't let go." Margaret's arms burned. Her grip slipped. Caleb pulled like he was dragging the sun back into the sky, muscles straining, breath ragged. With one final desperate heave, he hauled her up onto the loft floor. Margaret collapsed, gasping, palms bleeding. Caleb grabbed her and held her hard, too hard, as if the world might steal her again if he loosened his grip. "God," he whispered into her hair. "I thought I lost you." Margaret's breath came in sharp bursts. Caleb's hand shook against her back. His voice turned raw. "I can't lose you," he said. "I won't survive it twice." Margaret leaned into him, and in that embrace, something quiet and unstoppable clicked into place. That night, by the fire, Caleb stared into the flames like they were showing him something. He didn't reach for romance. He didn't dress it up. He simply said, "Marry me." Margaret's heart stuttered. Caleb rushed on, words stumbling out like they'd been trapped too long. I know it's not what people expect, but Margaret, I need you here. I want you here. Not as help. Not as," he swallowed, "as my family." Margaret stared at him, seeing beyond him, seeing the outline of his grief. She realized then that Caleb's kindness hadn't come from abundance. It had come from emptiness. He had known a house that once held laughter. He had known warmth, and then something had taken it. She didn't ask for details. She didn't need to. Loss had a common language. Margaret's voice came out soft. "Yes," she said. Caleb's eyes closed like a man finally putting down a weight he'd been carrying alone. "Yes," he whispered, disbelieving. "Yes," Margaret repeated. "I'll marry you." Outside, the wind moved across the land, and somewhere in the valley, a man like Blackwell would not take this news with grace, because men like Blackwell hated one thing more than defiance. They hated love. Love was a kind of rebellion they couldn't buy. Winter came hard. Not the picturesque kind of winter. The real kind. The kind that bit through cracks in walls and turned water buckets into stone. The kind that made animals meaner and people more desperate. Caleb and Margaret were married in the sheriff's office on a gray morning. Eliza stood behind them, hands clasped tight,
eyes shining like she was watching a miracle she didn't think she deserved to witness. No flowers, no music. Just vows spoken plainly. "I do," Caleb said, voice firm. "I do," Margaret replied, and the words sounded like freedom. They left the sheriff's office and stepped back into the cold, and for once, the cold didn't feel like punishment. It felt survivable. They returned to the ranch and kept working. They had to. Love didn't repair fences. Love didn't feed cattle. Love didn't keep the roof from leaking when the snow melted wrong. But love did something else. It made the work feel like building, not just enduring. One night, during a storm that rattled the house like an angry spirit, a knock came at the door. Not loud, desperate. Margaret opened it to find a young woman, half frozen, hair wet with snow, cheeks red, eyes wild. She collapsed into Margaret's arms like she'd been running from the devil. Eliza gasped. "It's Nora. She's from town." The woman shivered violently. He said he'd take me," she whispered. "He said if I didn't come, he'd ruin my family." Blackwell again. The valley's shadow. Caleb's face hardened in a way Margaret had never seen. Not rage for show. Rage for purpose. This time they didn't whisper to the sheriff. This time they dragged the truth into daylight. They went to the newspaper man, an old drunk who had once been idealistic, and now survived by printing funeral notices and crop reports. Caleb placed coin on his desk and said, "You print this, or I'll find someone who will." The man blinked at the money, then blinked at Margaret, an older woman standing straight, eyes steady. He cleared his throat. "Tell me." Nora told her story. Eliza told hers. Margaret watched their mouths form the words they'd been afraid to speak, and felt something in her chest harden into steel. Fear could rot people from the inside, but truth could burn, rot away. When the sheriff finally rode out with a warrant, he brought more men than he usually did. He brought men who wanted to be seen on the right side of history. Blackwell raged when they put him in irons. He screamed that he owned this valley, that everyone in it belonged to him. His eyes found Margaret as they dragged him out. "This is your fault," he hissed. "You'll lose everything." Margaret met his glare without blinking. She had already lost everything once. The threat had no teeth. Caleb stood beside her, hand firm around hers. "No," he said quietly. "We'll be fine, because we have each other. If this story has made you feel something, anger, hope, or recognition, don't let it pass quietly. Like this video, so more people hear it, and subscribe if you believe stories about dignity, love, and late beginnings deserve a place here. And if you've ever felt overlooked yourself, leave a comment below. We read every one. Spring came like a pardon. Grass returned in thin, stubborn lines, green as a promise. Calves stumbled into the world on legs too new to trust. The Sable River finally swelled with runoff, its water moving like a rumor of mercy. The ranch breathed easier. One evening, as sunset spilled copper across the hills, Margaret stood on the porch, watching Caleb mend a gate latch. He muttered at it like it was personally insulting him. "That latch hates you," Margaret said. Caleb paused, then smirked. "Everything hates me. I just outlast it." Margaret smiled, and the smile stayed. She had been nervous all day, carrying a secret so heavy it felt like a stone in her chest, but not the kind that sank, the kind that anchored. "Caleb," she said softly,
Come here. He looked up, concern flickering. What is it? Margaret took a breath. The doctor came by while you were in town. Caleb's posture tightened. Are you sick? Margaret shook her head, eyes shining. No, she whispered. I'm going to have a baby. The world stilled. Caleb stared at her, as if his mind couldn't find the shape of the words. A baby. At her age. After everything. Then his face changed. Not into skepticism, not into fear. Into wonder. He stepped forward slowly, like he was afraid sudden movement would break the moment. His hand lifted, hovering near her belly, reverent as prayer. A baby, he whispered. We're having a baby. His voice cracked. Tears startled their way down his cheeks, unashamed. Margaret felt tears rise too, hot and impossible. I didn't think it was possible, she admitted. Not at my age. Caleb let out a shaky laugh, the kind that sounded like relief escaping a locked room. You've spent months proving the world wrong, he said. Why stop now? That night they sat outside under stars sharp enough to cut. Caleb's hand rested on her belly, as if he could feel the future breathing. Margaret leaned into his shoulder, feeling something she had never allowed herself to feel before. Not hope. Hope was fragile. This was deeper than hope. This was belonging. Months later, the harvest gathering in Red Willow looked different. The drought had loosened its grip. People smiled without forcing it. Music drifted from a fiddle. Children ran between stalls. The air smelled of roasted meat and fresh bread, the kind of smells that made a town remember it was human. Margaret stood beside Caleb, belly round beneath her dress, cheeks warm. Eliza stood nearby too, wearing a clean shawl. Her posture straighter these days. Nora had come as well, laughing quietly with women who had once avoided her. The valley was learning new rules. Caleb surprised Margaret with a small gift, a silver bracelet, handmade, rough but beautiful. Carved into it were 3 shapes, a river, a barn, and a woman standing tall. You were never too old, Caleb murmured as he slid it onto her wrist. You were just surrounded by people too small to see you. Margaret's throat tightened. When Caleb lifted his voice to the crowd, it wasn't to boast. It was to testify. This is my wife, he said. Margaret Rourke. She saved my ranch. She saved my life. And she's giving me a future I thought was buried. The crowd cheered, some loudly, some quietly, some with the stunned humility of people remembering they once laughed at her. Margaret didn't care about their approval. But she did notice something. The laughter from the old days was gone. It had been replaced by something rarer, respect. Later, under a sky fading into violet, Margaret and Caleb walked home. Eliza walked ahead, humming. The road was the same road Margaret had once stared at from the auction platform, but it felt like a different world. Margaret said softly, I keep thinking about that day. Caleb glanced at her. The auction? Yes, she admitted. It still feels like a fever dream. Caleb's mouth curved. It wasn't a dream. Margaret's eyes glinted with dry humor. Good. Because if it was, it had terrible taste. Caleb laughed, full and surprised, and the sound carried out into the night like proof. The baby came on a cold morning, when the wind sounded like it was trying to pry the house apart. Margaret labored in the bedroom with Eliza beside her, hands steady, voice calm. Caleb paced outside the door like a man trying to fight the air. He muttered prayers he hadn't said since childhood. He threatened the universe with violence if it dared take anything else from him. When the baby finally arrived, crying and furious and alive, the sound struck Caleb like lightning. He stumbled into the room, eyes wild, and froze when Eliza placed the bundle into his arms. The child was tiny. Perfect. Caleb stared down at him like he was seeing color for the first time. "He's perfect," Caleb whispered. "Just like his mother." Margaret lay back against the pillow, exhausted, sweat-soaked, radiant in a way that had nothing to do with youth and everything to do with survival. Eliza wiped her eyes with her sleeve. "Can I hold him?" she asked, voice shaking. Margaret smiled. "Of course." Eliza cradled the baby with reverence, and Margaret realized something so profound it made her chest ache. This was her family. Not the one that had abandoned her. Not the one that sold her. This was the family built by choice, by courage, by people who refused to accept the world's cruel arithmetic. Caleb sat beside Margaret on the bed, baby sleeping against his chest. He reached for her hand. "I never thought I'd have this again," he said quietly. "A home, a family, a future." Margaret squeezed his hand. "Neither did I," she whispered. "But here we are." Outside, the ranch stretched across the valley, fences standing straighter than they had in years. The barn looked sturdier. The creek, nearly forgotten, murmured faintly like it approved. Inside, a family gathered around new life, bound not by blood alone, but by stubborn love. Margaret Hale had been told she was too old for love, too old for purpose, too old to matter. But the truth had been there all along, waiting for someone to say it out loud. She wasn't too old. She was simply in the wrong hands, and when the right hands offered choice instead of ownership, everything changed.